excuse me, giving us a rare example of a female engineer from this period. And her husband, Frank Gilbreth, is perhaps the most amusing efficiency expert. His dedication to efficiency was so great that he timed himself getting dressed, discovered he could save at least 4 seconds every morning by buttoning his vest from the bottom to the top rather than the top to the bottom. He tried shaving with 2 razors at once and saved quite a bit of time in shaving, but more than lost that time bandaging all the cuts he got afterwards. And his son, one of his sons, later claimed that he regretted the loss of time much more than he regretted the loss of blood. Speaking of children, he and his wife had 12. When he was questioned on this, he said it was cheaper by the dozen. He even tried to bring efficiency to that process, having the birth of, I believe, his 7th child filmed, which was so embarrassing to the filmmaker and the doctors and Mrs. Gilbreth that the cameraman forgot to take the lens cap off the camera, and the footage was spoiled, and they refused to try it for the 8th child. So that childbirth was not made any more efficient, at least by the Gilbreths, despite all the practice they had at it. So, mass production, especially the assembly line, was making manufacturing much more efficient. Henry Ford broke the manufacturing of his Model T down to 84 separate steps. Even the paint was efficient. Famously, it could be had in any color you wanted as long as you wanted it black. Black was cheap, durable, and dried more quickly than other colors of paint. So eventually Ford could turn out a Ford Model T about every 90 minutes. And the price dropped from $850 around 1908 or so to $290 by the late 1920s. And all that was more money than it is today. That was still pretty cheap. Cheap enough his own workers could afford to buy it, which he said was the secret to his success. In addition to there being new ways to make things, there were new ways to buy things. As new types of stores developed. Department stores, bringing many things together under one roof, had developed in the mid-1800s, but were becoming more widespread. They're also becoming more affordable. Woolworths developed the 5 and dime store, which, if you adjust for inflation, changes in purchasing power, was basically the dollar store of the late early 1900s, where you could go in and find everything at either 5 or 10 cents. So you no longer had to have trained clerks who remembered the location and value of everything on sale. By the early 20th century, grocery stores were being invented, Piggly Wiggly being the first of these, I believe, in which shoppers could simply go in, walk to the store with a buggy, and buy what they wanted, turning the ideas of unskilled labor to personal shopping. And if there are more ways to make things and more ways to buy things, there are also new ways to pay for things, as we develop better ways to go into debt. Or at least they became more widespread. The installment plan, paying some money down and the rest off over time, over months or even years, was not entirely a new idea, but became much more widespread in the 1920s. So people could now buy the things they wanted without having to save up for months or years. Many cars were bought on installment plans. Many radios were bought on installment plans. And radios, too, told people what they needed to buy. As advertising became more professional, more widespread. Radios developed in the 19-teens, but only became widespread in the 1920s. Early on, if you wanted a radio, you had to buy the kit and assemble it yourself. But once ready-made radios became available for purchase around 1920, radio went from being a hobby for nerds to being entertainment available for everyone, helping to create or expand a mass culture in America so people could hear the same news, the same entertainment, listen to the same music, so that pop tunes from New York City or jazz music from the lower Mississippi or country music from the southern Appalachians could go from being regional styles of music to national or even international styles of music. And so as it became easier to make stuff and people bought more things, companies began to produce more things. As companies produced more, they hired more workers, giving them more money to spend. As more people had money to spend, they bought more things. Manufacturers produced more things, employed more workers, who in turn bought more stuff, in a virtuous cycle that would clearly go on forever, of ever-increasing economic productivity. And as companies became more productive, they also became more profitable. And so people began to invest more in stocks. Although it's probably important not to overdo that idea. By the late 1920s, perhaps 4% of Americans owned stock, which on the one hand is far more than had ever owned stock before, but was still a fairly small percentage of the population, especially compared to today, where probably the majority of Americans, or at least something pretty close to that, own stock, at least indirectly, say through their membership in a 401k or 403b or a pension plan of some other kind, or of course outright purchasing stocks or mutual funds or things like that. Still, even if 4% of Americans owning stock at the time was not much compared to today, it was a lot more than in the past. And this too was becoming easier, once again through an expansion of debt, as it became possible or became widespread to buy stock on margin, paying just a percentage of the purchase price of the stock, sometimes as little as 10%, and paying the rest off later as your stock went up in value, as it was apparently guaranteed to do. And as more and more people speculated in stocks, banks became more involved in the stock market. More and more banks lending people money to buy stocks or investing in stocks themselves. A kind of retail banking, people's savings and home loans and so forth, became increasingly intertwined with investment banking. Indeed, people were speculating in stocks much more. Of course, there are three reasons to buy stock. One, at least if you're fabulously rich like J.P. Morgan or something, is to buy enough stock in a company to gain control of that company, or at least have a great deal of influence over its corporate decisions. But you also might buy stock to hold for the long term in hopes that a profitable company will pay a dividend as an investment. And that, for most people, if they bought stock at all, was probably why they did it for a long time. But of course, you can also speculate in stocks. And the idea of buy cheap and sell high. And this was becoming much more common in the 1920s, based on the idea that even if you borrowed money to buy stock, because they were certain to go up, you could pay off your debt later and the interest and still make a fair profit. And for much of the 1920s, this seemed to work. However, this was not true for everyone. Farmers in particular had troubles in the 1920s. While they'd enjoyed a great economic boom during World War I and immediately afterwards, by 1919, 1920, European farmers were back on the farm, were producing their own food again. Armies no longer had to march on their stomachs. And so the price of food crops fell once again. And the boll weevil continued to ravage cotton production in the South, so that many farmers once again fell into debt, and increasingly did have to compete with relatively large-scale industrial farms,